As the cliche entails, our keynote speaker for the evening needs no introduction, and yet it is fitting that we greet him accordingly, right? The host of the Ben Shapiro Show and the editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire. Ben Shapiro, among many things, is a best-selling author, a columnist, a speaker, a brilliant political cultural observer and communicator, a regular contributor to TV, radio news, a titan for objective truth, and a bronze wall against illogical thought. And while I've sometimes wondered what it would be like to challenge him to a game of chess, I've seen and heard from him enough from a distance that now that we've been together in person and had a chance to talk, I know that I'd never actually want to test the depth of his intellectual prowess. It's not a pretty sight to see me so quickly and so easily defeated and deflated. Gets pretty ugly. Ladies and gentlemen, it is both a privilege and a pleasure to introduce to you one of the brightest beaming minds in America and a friend to this humble congregation in Heartland, Michigan, Mr. Ben Shapiro.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. What a beautiful congregation you have. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be here. I talk a lot on my show and kind of in the various speeches that I give about the necessity for social fabric and the fact that diversity is wonderful so long as it's directed at a common goal. When I see communities like this, congregations like this, it really does give me hope for the country. And I want to talk about that tonight because I think one of the things that the country is missing is there's a tremendous focus on liberty and there's very little focus on virtue. And that's where we all come in as religious people, as people who actually care about God, as people who actually care about central eternal values. Our role right now has never been more vital because we are more divided than ever. That's because Americans really, unfortunately, don't have very much in common anymore. If you go back and read the Federalist Papers, the founders talk about the idea that we're a common people, we have a common heritage, we have a common background, we have a common history, we have a common set of values, and all of those things seem to be gone. Our institutions are under grievous assault right now. There are a lot of folks on one particular side of the aisle these days who are very angry at a series of institutions. This week we saw a lot of folks in the Democratic Party who are suggesting that the Senate actually be made they should be changed. It should be representative by population as opposed to 2 senators per state. This is because they're very angry that the Senate is dominated by Republicans, and so Republicans were able to appoint a couple of justices they didn't want to see appointed. So that institution has to go by the wayside. They obviously also don't like the Electoral College these days because of President Trump's election victory. Institutions all across America are under attack. Churches particularly are under attack from a left that believes that churches are trying to cram down a certain set of values, and thus they must be stopped. They must be stopped by the state. The state has to stop churches from teaching their kids actual, eternal, meaningful values. The state has to stop us from operating our businesses the way that we see fit. Our culture is under attack as well. The philosophy of multiculturalism that suggests that all cultures are equivalent, that they are all equally valuable, that if somebody comes across the border and has a different set of values, that value system must be taken as though it is exactly the same in terms of what it brings to the United States as any value system that has already pre-existed here. And that's not a case against immigration, but that is a case against the idea that all cultures are equal and that all cultures are equally capable of melding into the assimilating melting pot that was the United States of America. Our history is under attack as well. There are 2 visions of history in the United States right now. On the one hand, you have folks who say that America is the greatest country in world history. They say that our value system is the greatest value system in world history, that the Declaration of Independence on the one hand and the Constitution on the other enshrines certain valuable principles that mean something and that don't change over time, and that we haven't always lived up to those principles, but the history of the United States is a history of a glorious people doing glorious things and falling short, but picking ourselves up again and moving toward the fulfillment of those principles. And then on the other side, you have a bunch of folks who believe that America was rooted in hierarchical evil, It was rooted in racism, sexism, bigotry, homophobia. America was rooted in all of these terrible power structures and power relationships, and that therefore American history is really a series of bad things punctuated by a few accidental lucky steps. That everything that is bad in the world can be attributed to America, and everything that is good in the world can be attributed to universal civilization. So landing on the moon is not an American achievement, that's an international achievement, but slavery is uniquely American. And this is the view of a lot of folks on one side of the aisle. When you believe that, for example, that you shouldn't be able to quote Churchill, this is a controversy this week. There's an astronaut named Scott Pelley, and Pelley had the temerity on Twitter to quote Winston Churchill. And then he actually was forced to apologize by people for quoting Winston Churchill, because when he said, I didn't know that Winston Churchill was a racist. I didn't realize that Winston Churchill stood for atrocities. Now, he didn't know anything about Winston Churchill, so he just took everything that was being said about Winston Churchill at face value. Suffice it to say, all of the social justice warrior 17-year-olds who were very angry at Scott Kelly for quoting Winston Churchill would be speaking German if it weren't for Winston Churchill. But that doesn't really matter these days. All that matters, according to a lot of folks on one side of the aisle, is that our history is a history of sin. George Washington was not the father of our country or a great man. He was a slaveholder. Abraham Lincoln was not the man who preserved the Union and ensured that the blessings of the Constitution and the guarantees of the Constitution were applied to black folks in the United States. Abraham Lincoln was a racist who originally wanted to recolonize black folks from the United States back into Africa, and so he has to be thrown out as well. We can always dig up something historically that makes people look like anachronisms are terrible. It's really not hard to do that, because the history of the world is filled with bad ideas. The question is, why is America such a great place? And the answer is because America is filled with great ideas, and was always filled with great ideas. But there's one side of the aisle that doesn't believe that. Well, if you have that fundamental disagreement, there's no way to bridge that gap. And finally, there is just an enormous amount of personal dislike in our society right now. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people don't actually hang out with each other all that much outside of places like church. So if you don't go to church with somebody, the chances that you're hanging out with them outside of church are actually pretty low. There's a famous sociologist from Harvard named Robert Putnam. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. He pointed out that in the 1950s, the number one growth area in the American economy was bowling alleys. That bowling alleys were popping up everywhere. Why? Because every single person was basically a member of a bowling league. Now, very few people overall are members of bowling leagues, and so you've seen all these bowling alleys shut down. Instead, we have fake friendships on social media, or we have text, or we have phone, but very few people are actually spending the amount of time with one another to allow them to supersede the vision they have of the other person. It's fascinating how personal contact with other people actually allows you to see people in a better light. There's a famous study that was done in the 1930s, a really kind of interesting study, in which the scientists went around, social scientists went around the United States. They were Asian. And they went around the United States, and they stayed at a bunch of different hotels. And no problem. The folks let them in. They were allowed to stay at all these various hotels. Then they called up the hotels on the phone, and they said, do you allow Asian people to stay in your hotels? And virtually all of these hotels that they just stayed at said, no, we don't allow Asian people to stay at the hotels. What changed is that they actually showed up, and they had a face-to-face conversation with someone, and things changed. That's fallen by the wayside as well. So hatred, antipathy, anger at each other, this is at highs that we haven't really seen in the United States since the 1960s at the very least. Now, the question is why? I think the actual reason is because of the decline of Judeo-Christian values in our society. I think Judeo-Christian values have taken a real 2x4 to the face. I think that the values that were embedded in biblical living have basically been thrown out in favor of this new idea that secular humanism is going to save all of us. The only problem with that is that secular humanism has not actually saved all of us. Because secularism inherently does not give us the fundamental basis for why human beings have value. The most important single sentence ever written in human history, and in my opinion, and I'm sure most of the people in this room, wasn't written by humans. The single most important sentence is that man was made in God's image. Right? That is the single most important verse in the Bible. In my view, it is the single most important image in the history of mankind, is that human beings have innate value. And that innate value is what you can build on. You can build on that. But we have decided that we don't need the Bible for that anymore. Reason can bring us to it. The only problem, of course, is that reason cannot bring you to that. Reason can bring you to a lot of places, but it can't bring you to the inherent value of each individual human being. Because it turns out that for most of human history, people didn't believe that. For most of human history, people enslaved one another because they didn't believe every individual had value. For most of human history, Men thought that women were lesser beings. For most of human history, people thought that people of different tribes and different races did not have these same sorts of value. It took a revelation for that to be understood by human beings. And without that revelation, everything collapses into dust. In the United States, we are built on basically two central foundational principles: liberty and virtue. This is what we are built on: liberty and virtue. And these can only coexist. They're in tension, liberty and virtue, because liberty sort of suggests you can do whatever you want, and virtue suggests you obviously can't. Right? You have duties. The only way that liberty and virtue can coexist is if you believe that the goal of being free is to be virtuous. If you believe that the goal of being a free human being, a person with rights, is to fulfill your duties, then these two things can coexist. If you believe that liberty on its own is just an inherent good, then no matter what, whatever you do, liberty is the fundamental conceit, well, pretty soon things are going to collapse because people tend to use their liberty against one another if unconstrained by duty. This is where religion comes in. This is why religion matters. Liberty was always embedded in Judeo-Christian ideals, right? The idea of freedom ringing out, and the idea of the Exodus from Egypt. But it was always counterbalanced by duty. People always forget the end of the verse in Exodus. When God says to Pharaoh via Moses, "Let my people go," it's not just let my people go. It's let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness. It's connected with that second half. Liberty has to be connected with actual obligations, or liberty devolves into libertinism, into doing whatever you want and mistreating other people if you see fit to do so. In Judaism, it's pretty clear. I speak more about Judaism because everybody in the room knows more about Christianity than I do. But on Judaism, I know a few things. So on Judaism, the funny hat says so. So Judaism is very big on the idea that you're supposed to live, as we say, besimcha, in joy. God commands you to live in joy. But what does it mean to be happy in Judaism? Well, in Judaism, being happy is to walk with God. Right? Rabbi Tarfon says in Ethics of the Fathers, "The day is short, the work is great, the workers are lazy, but the reward is great, and the master of the house is knocking at the door." Serving God and following God is where you find joy. Right? As Solomon says, there's nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work because that is their lot. If you're not enjoying what you were put on earth to do, then you're doing happiness wrong. You may be experiencing something akin to pleasure, but it's not the same thing as the deep, abiding spiritual happiness that arises when you know that you are living in accordance with a more important purpose. This isn't just unique to Judaic thought or Christian thought either, by the way. There was this idea sort of embedded in ancient Greek thought as well, which is why early church leaders, and I would say the New Testament, is replete with an attempt to merge the revelation of Sinai with some of the rationality of Greece. And this is why the New Testament is written in Greek. It's one of the reasons, as opposed to Aramaic, which was actually the lingua franca of the time. It's also why the term logos is used at the very beginning of the New Testament, is specifically because the idea is that in the Christian view, Christ is the logic of the universe. And the reason is supposed to be attached to all of this. Well, the ancient Greeks saw a similar requirement for purpose, that happiness was not just about your day-to-day pleasure, it was also about living a life in a well-lived fashion. So how did you do this? Well, you did this by pursuing the good. What was the good? The good was not some moral idea that we made up. The good was being useful. What was good was what was useful in the Greek thought. So what makes a good hammer? What makes a good hammer is that it serves its purpose as a hammer. A bad hammer is a hammer that falls apart as soon as you hit a nail with it. A good hammer is a hammer that you can strike many nails with and it continues to function properly. What is a good human being? A person who operates according to their purpose, a person who operates according to virtue, which in the Greek view meant fulfilling your reason. Well, these two twin poles, reason and revelation, this is what built the West. These were the foundations of the West. And this was reflected in the American bargain. America was the apotheosis of this. America was the apex of this idea. Because on the one hand, you had the reason of the founding fathers who believed in Enlightenment philosophy, who did believe that human beings had a unique capacity for reason that ought to be applied to the problems in front of them and to the evidence in front of them. And on the other hand, the founders were, in large part, deeply religious human beings. And even if they were not personally religious, they certainly recognized the value of religion for a society. Even the most deistic of the founders recognized that the presence of a God standing behind history and providing a logic to the universe was required in order for people to live virtuous lives. George Washington put the synthesis well in his letter to the Protestant Episcopal Church in 1789, quote, "The consideration that human happiness and moral duty are inseparably connected will always continue to prompt me to promote the progress of the former by inculcating the practice of the latter." He said it even better in his first inaugural address. He said, "The foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality." Private morality. This was the thing that the founders did that was truly unique. Because for most of human history, even those people who believed in virtue believed that government could help cram down virtue. What the founders believed is that virtue could only truly be reached by people living in liberty, exercising their free will to pursue that virtue. That cramming down from the top was actually likely to backfire in a lot of ways, and that instead what you needed was a people committed to virtuous living with the freedom to actually live out that virtuous lifestyle. Without virtue, we collapse. John Adams says, "We have no government armed with a power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Well, these foundations have now been ripped apart because both of these poles, reason and revelation, liberty and virtue, they've been thrown out. First, we threw out biblical virtue. So the goal of a lot of Enlightenment thinkers was to move beyond the Bible. This was a self-defeating goal. The basic workable principles of the Enlightenment were built on biblical principles. There's this weird idea going around these days that Enlightenment philosophy sort of just popped into existence out of nowhere in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's just not true at all. I mean, it is just not true. The fact is that it was an outgrowth of religious theology that was 2,000 years long at that point. It was an outgrowth of the rise of Protestantism. It was an outgrowth of the Peace of Westphalia. There's a long human history is a continuum. And there are a lot of people today, the Steven Pinkers of the world, who sort of suggest that the Enlightenment popped out of nowhere. That was the good stuff. Just ditch all the religion and we're good to go. The problem is that the foundations on which the Enlightenment are built, things like human reason, how can you be a believer in human reason, just as a concept, if all you believe is that human beings are basically free will-less, missing free will, balls of meat wandering through the universe? Right? That is the actual scientific materialist view. The scientific materialist view, the reasoned scientific view, is that you have no free will. You were just born into a situation that you don't know anything about. You are a combination of your genetics and your environment. You don't have the capacity to choose. You think you do, but you're being lied to by your own brain. You are just a ball of meat wandering through the universe with no actual inherent value. How could you possibly build a moral system on the basis of that? How could you even say that it's your goal to reason on the basis of that? The notion of reason, the notion of abstract reason, doesn't exist in this universe. If you're a scientific materialist, as so many of the atheist community purport to be, then all reason is just firing of neurons in a particular order. Well, what makes certain firing of neurons better than other firing of neurons? Why should I reason with you instead of clubbing you over the head and taking your stuff? It seems to me that that would actually be, and has been throughout human history, slightly more efficient than reason. But by getting rid of God, they thought they would free the world to be ensconced in reason. But the problem is that even if you believe, but let's assume that reason still exists. Let's assume that reason exists in the absence of a divine power who gave us the spark of creative light that allows us to be reasonable and choose our own paths in the world. Let's assume none of that is true. Let's assume that reason still exists anyway, for some reason. For some odd reason we can't explain, reason still exists, right? This is sort of the Sam Harris view, and Sam and I have had this argument many times. Well, the problem is that reason, without the idea of individual human value created by the Judeo-Christian system, reason without the idea of virtue leads you directly to two alternative paths. One path is passionate utopianism, a desire to remake the world in a model that you think is most reasonable. In the 19th century, this view was best summed up by a philosopher, a French philosopher named Auguste Comte, who basically suggested that the government could remodel human beings by using communal mechanisms to do so, and that we could simply retrain human beings. Well, this, of course, ends in gulags and gas chambers. And this philosophy that the community at large can reshape individual human beings because that's what rationality says we ought to do, that takes you pretty quickly to, okay, whose rationality? Well, my rationality, not your rationality. You're just wrong, right? And I don't value you as a human being, or at least I have no reason to do so. See, the thing is that a lot of these secular humanists who believe in individual human value, they're still living off the fumes of Judeo-Christian religion. They just refuse to recognize it. The gas tank is empty. The fumes are still there. They're living off the fumes, but now the gas tank is running out of fumes. And so what you're seeing is passionate utopianism rising again, with radical left groups in the United States suggesting we need collectivism trumping individual rights. You see this in Europe as well, collectivism trumping individual rights. You see it on the far right as well, folks who believe that individual rights are passé. The alt-right sort of suggests this in the United States. You see this also on the far right in certain European countries. This idea, the sort of quasi-fascist groups, this idea that the collective trumps the individual. Right? That's because we have moved away from Judeo-Christian values, and we thought reason could stand in, but reason can't stand in, because it turns out that reason itself is based on certain core assumptions about what human beings are, and those core assumptions can either be made out of nowhere or they come from revelation. The second possibility, as opposed to passionate utopianism, is nihilism. Once you get rid of virtue and liberty, you're left with basically nihilism, right? Nothing means anything, pleasure-seeking, simple pleasure-seeking, my emotions mean everything. And this, in turn, ends up in many of the same places as passionate utopianism, because if in the end all that matters is you and your subjective beliefs, well, then why should you respect anybody else's rights? This is why I get shut down on college campuses, right? I go there and people say I'm microaggressing them, I'm hurting their feelings. And therefore my hurting their feelings is the same thing as me physically hurting them, because their feelings are paramount, my rights are not paramount. You saw some of this stuff with regard to Brett Kavanaugh. And this argument was made with Judge Kavanaugh. It was an astonishing argument, frankly, that Judge Kavanaugh, an allegation was made against him. There was no corroborative evidence with regard to Judge Kavanaugh. Now, everybody in this audience, everybody in the United States believes that if Judge Kavanaugh, indeed, as a 17-year-old boy, threw a 15-year-old girl on a bed and tried to rape her, this is a bad thing. Right? Everyone agrees. There is no dissent on this. Not only is it a bad thing, I think the vast majority of people, right and left, agree that probably that guy shouldn't be on the Supreme Court if that's what happened. But you cannot damn a man to hell without any sort of corroborative evidence. And in Jewish theology, Satan is the accuser. Right? Even he has to marshal some evidence. There needs to be some evidence that the guy did something bad. Well, there was a certain type of column that started popping up in the wake of the allegations against Judge Kavanaugh. And the weird column went something like this. I'm a woman, I was raped, therefore Kavanaugh's guilty. This was an argument that was actually made over and over. Connie Chung did it in the Washington Post most famously. She said, when I was a 20-year-old woman, I was sexually abused by my gynecologist, and now I believe Ford. I believe Christine Blasey Ford. And the question is, what does that have to do with anything? Right? It has nothing to do with anything. So a guy who is not Kavanaugh did something bad to you who are not Christine Blasey Ford, and therefore Kavanaugh did something bad to Christine Blasey Ford. Like, there's no logical progression from one to the other. But because you believe that feelings are paramount, it doesn't matter what the objective truth is. The only thing that matters is that you feel that Judge Kavanaugh should be punished. You feel that he is guilty. It doesn't matter whether you have any evidence. The only thing that matters is how you feel about this stuff. This is why you saw people screaming into senators' faces saying, you're disrespecting my sexual assault if you vote for Kavanaugh. In what way? Your sexual assault has nothing to do with Brett Kavanaugh. Even if Brett Kavanaugh were guilty of something that had nothing to do with you, you weren't there. You don't know anybody. Like, when I saw Alyssa Milano and characters like that saying, well, they believe that Brett Kavanaugh was guilty, I thought, well, my gardener doesn't. And he knows the same amount that you do about this particular case. But this sort of nihilism is what replaces reason when reason is undermined because you actually don't have a really solid rational basis for reason itself. So what do we need in order to bring the country back together? Well, I think the first thing we need is more churches. I think the first thing we need is more synagogues. And I think we need churches and synagogues that are dedicated to the welfare of their members, but more importantly, even than the welfare of their members, is a common goal in the service of eternal values. And that means that, as I've talked about ad nauseum on my show and in my columns, this kind of newfangled religion where we think we're going to draw young people in with bands and pizza. Okay, we've been doing this a lot in the Jewish community. The only growing segment of the Jewish community is the Orthodox community. Every other area of the Jewish community is declining. There's a reason for that. Number one, people who are not Orthodox don't have kids in the Jewish community. The average Orthodox family has 4.1 children. The average non-Orthodox family is below replacement rates. They have less than 2 children. But beyond that, it's also because when you go to my synagogue, there's a reason to be there. When I bring my kids to the synagogue, it's important for them to be there because we are reading the Bible every single week. And in really Orthodox communities, and if I had the time, I'd be going, every single day. The reality is that sort of commitment to a value system beyond your own is what draws people to church in the first place. You can't replace that with fun and good times. Because guess what? Hate to break it to everybody, church ain't that fun. Okay, neither is synagogue. I mean, as much as people say this sort of stuff, oh yeah, if it were, you'd take your girlfriend on dates there, right? It's a good place to meet girls, right? It's a good place to meet girls, synagogue or church. But then when on like your fifth date, when you have your kids, when you have the babysitter come over, you're like, you know what? Let's have a good time, honey. Let's go to church. Maybe you guys are holier than I am, but that's not what I do with my wife. What brings me back to synagogue time and time again is the fact that there is something that actually means something there. And that's what's going to bring the country together again. That doesn't mean that we're theocrats. It doesn't mean that we're cramming down our values on anyone else. It means that we are providing a rational basis for the values on which America was built. This attempt to remove religion from America's foundations and remove those values from America's foundations is just foolhardy. It doesn't work. The Ten Commandments were the foundational lodestar for the United States. The original seal of the United States was actually, Adams wanted it to be an actual engraving of Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt and splitting the Red Sea. That's actually what he wanted it to be. There was discussion at the founding whether Hebrew should actually be included among the original languages of the United States. The founders knew full scale that the Bible mattered, and they knew that these values mattered. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about this. This is what makes America different than all of the countries of Europe. It's that we have all these social ties. Right? We all care about each other. We have this social fabric. When something goes wrong, we go to our friends and our family, and we know those people because we go to the same institutions that they go to. The way that a society is supposed to work is family first, and then church, and then broader church, and then finally state as the backstop for things that are bad that are happening in your life. But as the government has gotten bigger and bigger, and people have moved away from church in response, the government continues to grow bigger and bigger because we figure we have no backstop except for the government itself. The only way that we're going to get out of this rut, the only way that we're going to solve an enormous number of problems, both financial and, I think, moral, is for us to return to those baseline values that illuminated the country in the first place. And the values that illuminated the country were predicated on values far older than that. So I'm really grateful to be able to speak to you guys tonight. I'm really grateful to speak to a group of folks who understand the value of something deeper, something meaningful, something that didn't start, a set of values that wasn't created last week by the Supreme Court, a set of values that actually is rooted in tradition and history and, yes, human nature and God's understanding of human nature. Because without those values, society will collapse in on itself. But if we are able to rekindle those values, then we can bring the United States back together once again. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. Howdy. I think a microphone is coming to you. Oh, okay.
Hey, Ben, how are you? Hey.
There we go. Yeah,
hey.
Gotcha.
So I guess my question is, how do you remain optimistic in the face of what we're all being faced with as conservatives today? I work at a liberal arts college on the west side of the state, and a conservative liberal arts college, Christian college, and the past few years I've been seeing a lot of rhetoric come up. In fact, just walking past classrooms, hearing the things that are being taught about inequity and things of that nature. Tim actually mentioned, at the Harvard Law School, we had all the students heading down, to protest Kavanaugh, something they had no evidence to support any of their claims. And seeing a lot of the problems coming out of universities these days, out of mid-20-somethings. I'm part of the equation. I'm hopeful that when they get into reality and get a job, a lot of these students, that they'll be able to, get penalized, I guess, with the reality of life, and then essentially come around to understanding conservatism and sympathizing with our argument. But at the same time, it's just really hard to stay optimistic.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a couple of causes for optimism. Number one, I think that our chief optimism, and the optimism that I feel, is when I'm walking through the school back there, right? I think that the optimism should be with the 7-year-olds, not with the 22-year-olds. Because those are the kids that we actually have an opportunity to mold right now. All those 22-year-olds were once 7-year-olds, and it seems like a lot of their parents didn't do a very good job. But with that said, I think that a lot of the 21, 22-year-olds, what they're experiencing right now, and this I do see, is a great frustration with the state of politics in the country. And this is where I'm optimistic. There are a lot of 21, 22-year-olds who are sick of the idea that all conversation has to be silenced, who are appalled by the fact that the left actually believes that everybody who doesn't agree with them should shut up. And they're sick of the bullying. And what that's actually leading to is a libertarianish streak in a lot of young people. Now, libertarian doesn't get you all the way to virtue. But what it does do is it at least gets you away from government cram downs. And then it's our job to fill that gap. Because what libertarianism does is it emphasizes the value of the individual away from the government. And then it turns out that individuals actually do still want social bonds, and those social bonds can be filled by family and community. So getting people away from the fake social bond that government supposedly represents is the first step. And then you can fill that gap with, frankly, love. You can fill that gap with reaching out to people on an individual level and helping them. I do put an enormous amount of stake in the building of social capital, and there are very few institutions in the United States dedicated to building social capital. Religious institutions have a long history of doing so.
Hello again. And congratulations on your television show.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Now, I'm going somewhat deep in the weeds. It's aside from what you talked about, but I've got you cornered. Do you, when you started out with the Trump thing, were you not a never-Trumper, and have you come around, and are you in the cult now?
Yeah, I didn't vote for Trump. And the reason that I didn't vote for Trump is because I had three serious concerns about then-candidate Trump. One was that he would not govern conservatively because he'd been all over the place in terms of his positions over history. And so I wasn't fully convinced that he was actually going to be a conservative. That concern obviously has been massively alleviated. He's governed incredibly conservatively, to my great happiness and delight. Second concern was that he was going to soul-suck the Republican Party. My concern there was that he was going to do things that were bad, and conservatives were going to follow him down that path. It's been kind of half alleviated, let me say. I think that what's been clear to me is that people who are Republicans don't see President Trump as a thought leader as much as a vessel for pushing certain values and certain policies more than values. Right? That he's going to give us a conservative court, for example. That's the thing you hear from a lot of Republicans. I don't hear a lot about Republicans saying, well, his economic theory is really first rate, because he doesn't have one. So or if he does have one, it's got some serious flaws. So that's been half alleviated. The part where I think it has not been totally alleviated, and this was a serious concern during the campaign, it remains a serious concern today, is when the president says stuff that is actively morally bad, people on our side of the aisle should say that's an actively morally bad thing for him to say. That doesn't mean I don't support him, doesn't mean I don't want him to do well, doesn't mean I won't vote for him. But if you actually want to retain any shred of credibility with the people you're talking to, especially your own moral credibility, not his, right? The president can defend himself. He's quite good at it, as we've noticed, right? He likes punching things. As I've said many times, the president is a hammer in search of a nail, right? He's either, when he hits a nail, it's great. When he hits a baby, it's not so great. But people make a decision about you as a human being based on how you respond to the events that you see in your life. So after, for example, the president was caught on tape saying vile things about women, it was incumbent on even people who voted for him to say, listen, I'm going to vote for him anyway because he's going up against Hillary Clinton, and that dog ain't going to hunt. But that said, that's a really gross thing to say, and nobody should act like that, right? That's actually, you can do it both ways. You can say what he said here is bad. What I was afraid of is that if he was elected, it was going to exacerbate the condition of people who are on my side of the aisle suddenly saying it's okay to do all sorts of bad things, because I don't think it's okay to do bad things, even if it's somebody who's on my side of the aisle. The third concern is still my deepest concern. This one's still on the table. And to forecast where the end of this answer is going, I'm highly likely to vote for President Trump for re-election. But with that said, my third concern is still very much on the table. And that third concern was that he was absolutely going to be toxic with a lot of growing demographic groups in the United States. This is particularly true among women. There's a really bad gender gap for President Trump, particularly among women right now. And that's because the president is the president. He has not stopped being Donald Trump. Right? He had an opportunity after being elected to really kind of grow into the office and become a different human. I'm not saying he's been ineffective. I think he's been quite effective in a lot of ways. But as a character, he's still the same guy who he was 10 years ago. I mean, he's 71 years old, right? 72 years old. He's not going to be changing anytime soon. I mean, he's not going to be putting on the collar. So, so that said, I'm concerned still that he's toxifying the Republican Party as a brand to a lot of young folks, which is why I think it's important for a lot of people who are not the president to call it out. Again, that reinforces the idea that when the president says stuff that is bad, it's very important, especially for his supporters, to say, Mr. President, that's not good. It's bad that you did that. And the kind of, soft tiptoeing around the issue that's happened with a lot of Republicans because the president happens to have a very thin skin and he gets offended easily and then he lashes out. There are a lot of people who, well, I don't want to criticize him. I'm afraid he's going to lash out at me. Well, that's why you when people say he's like King David, okay, King David, number one, repented. And number two, the prophet Nathan was enjoined to yell at him when King David did something bad. So it's not our job to say whether he's King David. That's God's job to say whether he's King David. It's our job to be Nathan. Right? Nathan was on King David's side, so it's our job to be Nathan and say when he's done something wrong. With all of that said, am I more likely to vote for him now? Yeah, of course, because as I said, I had 3 concerns. 2 of them, one has been completely alleviated. The second has been mostly alleviated. The third is still on the table. And also, the Democrats have demonstrated, I was never going to vote for Democrats anyway, but they've demonstrated full scale how insane they've gone. And that has exacerbated the problem, obviously. So what I say is, so just final note, I was never Trump during the election, meaning I would not vote for him because he did not earn my vote. I never encouraged people not to vote for him. I said, I understand why you would vote for him to stop Hillary. I can't do it. Also, I wasn't in a swing state. I was in California, so my vote doesn't matter really anyway. But with that said, I didn't vote for him, as opposed to Roy Moore, who I actively told people not to vote for. Right? I told people not to vote for Roy Moore because Roy Moore was allegedly, and in my belief, practically molesting 14-year-old girls. I don't think that person should sit in the United States Senate, no matter how much I agree with some of his values. With that said, I've called myself since the day of the election sometimes Trump, because once the president's the president, then you are sometimes for the president, you are sometimes against the president. When he does good stuff, I love it and I call it fair, and when he does bad stuff, I don't like it. Right? I coined on my show the notion of good Trump, bad Trump. We have a jingle, we play it. Right? Good Trump, bad Trump, which one will it be today? And you just don't know. So.
Thank you again for being here. I have a question. When you argue, or not argue, but have discussions with liberals, this is my sister. She was a diehard liberal for years.
Howdy, wow.
And I was a conservative, and we'd go back and forth. And the thing that she always came down to was, well, then you don't have any, you don't have a heart for poor people because you don't care about all these handouts and things like that. And actually, the only reason she's a conservative now is because she started listening to your show and couldn't come up with good arguments, right? So. But my point is, how do you really do you have a strong, concise, like, here you go, when you do argue with someone like that, when they come up from an emotional standpoint?
So I think that the proper argument is that charity has to be applied in the way that is most useful to the person who is receiving the charity. So if we're talking about charity, then you have to talk about the highest forms of charity. So Maimonides, a great Jewish philosopher, said that the highest form of charity is giving somebody a job. Right? Hiring somebody is the highest form of charity. Well, in order to hire somebody, I have to have the money to hire them. So taxing me, taking away my money, and my ability to hire a person actually is not helping a lot of people, right? When you take my money away, that's an opportunity cost for me to hire some people. My company employs 55 people. And my wife and I have a bunch of people who work in various auspices doing different jobs for us, just as everybody does. Right? We have different contractors that we use. The way economics works is that voluntary contract allows me to employ somebody in a way that is going to allow them to grow as in both their work and also cultivate a skill set. Now, there's a group of people who legitimately have no capacity to get a job. If you're talking about folks who have mental illness or physical incapacity, right, then the question is, where should the charity come from? And my view has always been charity first starts with the family, and then it moves out to the broader community. And this is why I place such heavy emphasis on the fact that religious people in the United States give enormously more charity than non-religious people in the United States. It's very easy to be generous with somebody else's money. It's not quite as easy to be generous with your own money. But it seems that the people who are the most generous with their own money in the United States are the people who believe in God and go to church regularly. Red states, which are on average not as rich as blue states, give more charity than blue states on a per capita basis. On a per capita basis, folks who are conservative give more charity than folks who are on the left. Bill de Blasio gave like $200 to charity out of $180,000 or $200,000. Even when even at times when I've made that kind of money, I was not giving $200 to charity. I mean, that's ridiculous. So the fact that the fact that folks on the left believe that charity means putting their hand into somebody else's pocket to give the charity, and then they call themselves charitable, I find kind of insulting. If we actually want to be a charitable society, we should start with the idea that you're supposed to cultivate your own charitable sense of giving, and then you can talk about the guy next door and whether he is giving charity. And if there's a situation in which a community is completely failing to take care of a group of people, then you can talk about moving to the broader community. But you start here, and then you move out, as opposed to the left, which simply suggests that the broad community has a responsibility for this individual, and then it turns out that you can't move in again, right? The community is not going to support something the federal government is already supporting.
Hi, Ben.
Howdy.
So I would take a bet that I'm probably the only atheist in this room, given that we have Lutherans. No, hey, we got one more. We got two. Okay. At the risk of
Well,
this...
by the way, thank you for coming, even though you're atheist, so I appreciate it.
Yeah. At the risk of this turning into a Ben Shapiro destroys video on YouTube, I'm going to try and keep this contained. From what I can tell, you want to elevate the presence of church in general, or a virtuous theistic presence in the United States, and decrease the presence of the totalitarian state.
Correct.
Okay. If that's the case, can you please describe to me the difference that you see between the evils of an overarching state and the evils of an overarching theocracy or
Sure.
theocratic presence?
Well, the use of force. That's the entire thing. I don't think that churches should have the power to compel. I don't think synagogues should have the power to compel. I think that they have the power to appeal. And if you want to voluntarily engage, I'm encouraging people in church to voluntarily engage with others, but I don't think that my synagogue should be able to go round people up and bring them into the synagogue. First of all, I think that it's counterproductive. I think it drives people away from religion to actually do that. I think people are driven by love to religion. I think they're driven by force away from religion. It's a feeling of repression and oppression that makes people drop away from religion in the first place. You know, that's the key distinction. I don't want anybody forced to do anything. I just think that if as a society we don't have any sort of centralizing values, then it's very easy for our atomized lives to spin us off into a sort of selfishness that doesn't actually allow for the retention of the rights that even libertarians want. Because it turns out there's a backlash. If you have a bunch of people who actively are acting in what they perceive are greedy fashion, then the society at large tends to call for more government intervention to rectify the problem. Every right has a duty attached to it. Good people, it's kind of fascinating. If you look at different societies around the world, what you see is that people who have inherently community-oriented and good values can actually do decently in a variety of economic systems. So people point at, for example, the Nordic countries on the left, and they say, well, the Nordic countries do great, right? The Nordic countries are pretty wealthy. There are a lot of holes with how the Nordic countries run their social welfare state, and we can get into the vagaries of that. But what they say is that these Nordic countries do really well, right? Because they have very high levels of social capital. Those levels of social capital were built over the course of centuries, people who have a certain common set of values. And just throwing a bunch of people together without a common set of values is not likely to actually increase the social capital in a particular area. It's my deep belief that that a lot of the core values that are necessary for a civilized society rely on people who go to church. So let me make clear something else. I don't think that every atheist is immoral. I don't think that every religious person is moral. I think there are a lot of immoral religious people, and I think that there are a lot of atheists who live moral lives aside from going to church. I just don't think that you can rationally sustain a rights-based, virtue-based system on the basis of a godless system. Even the Greeks thought this. Even Voltaire thought this, right? Voltaire is an atheist, and he famously said, you know, I may be an atheist, but I certainly hope that my housekeeper is not. Because he didn't want his housekeeper robbing him, right? So, you know, again, I think that the great distinction comes down to you should be able to live however you want. You should be able to do what you want. It's a free country. I believe in those rights. But if you want the country to be better, you should use those rights to promulgate virtue instead of promulgating vice. And I think right now people are using the rights to promulgate vice instead of virtue, and then that's extending into the vice of actually taking other people's stuff and trying to control other people's lives.
Hey Ben, I'm currently a student at University of Michigan, and I was
good luck
just,
to you, man.
Yeah, thanks. And I was just wondering if there was one point that you think you could convey to like a college student who's on the other side of the aisle of like conservatism and kind of holding those values. What would that one point be?
I mean, I think that the one point that I would convey to people on the other side of the aisle is actually an injunction, a negative injunction. As a Jew, I'm fond of negative injunctions. I like the thou shalt nots a lot. Those are some of my favorites because it's a lot easier to tell people what not to do than to tell them what to do. But if I were to convey something to people on the left, it would be thou shalt not indict somebody else's character without any evidence, because that is the way the left likes to argue. Folks on the left like to say that you're a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe without any evidence whatsoever, and then suggest that if you counter them, then this just proves that you are a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe. And the proper answer to your racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe is an unprintable four-letter word I can't say here, right? Followed by you, right? Because you don't actually get to impugn somebody's character. First time cursing's ever been applauded here, but But you don't get to impugn somebody else's character on the basis of political disagreement alone. You actually have to show why that person is the thing that you say that they are. Once you take that baton out of the hands of folks on the left, they have to sit down and have a rational conversation, you would hope, on the basis of competing ideas and facts. All too often they walk away, but that's their problem. You didn't want to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't believe that in the first place.
Hello, Mr. Shapiro. I listen to your podcast regularly and rated it 5 stars on iTunes, so keep up the great work.
Perfect, thank you.
I know from listening to your podcast that you advocate for speaking on pro-life issues using secular arguments and not religious arguments.
Right.
Are there any social issues that we should advocate using our Judeo-Christian beliefs?
So I think that value systems can be Judeo-Christian in origin, but you have to make a secular argument that appeals to people beyond the Bible. So when I say don't make a Judeo-Christian argument, what I really mean is not don't make a Judeo-Christian argument. I mean don't make, because I think, frankly, that virtually every conversation that takes place in a Judeo-Christian society is rooted in those values. This is the argument I've made to Sam Harris. I said to Sam Harris, full atheist, very, very vocal atheist, I said to him, Sam, it's very weird. You and I have 95% of the same values. Why do you think that is? And Sam said, well, you know, I got my values from Buddhism, I studied Buddhism, and I studied Eastern religion. I said, right, but I have those same values. I didn't study any of those things. So why do we have the same values? Could it be it's because we grew up 10 miles from each other in a Judeo-Christian country with a 3,000-year common history? Maybe it's that. And so when I say that you should make a secular argument, I'm not saying that that is completely separable from the Judeo-Christian history of these arguments. These arguments can only be made in a society that still is operating off the fumes of the values that I'm talking about. But I really believe that it's a mistake to ever make an argument on the basis of biblical text with people who don't believe in the Bible. It's alienating and it's not productive. They don't believe what you're saying. You may as well be quoting to them from Biff's sports book from 1985. It doesn't mean anything. You can't actually convince somebody by saying, you know, well, the Bible says, and they go, well, I don't believe the Bible. It's a book of myth. And it's like, okay, well, where does this conversation go from here except for down? You know, every argument that you make in a political context should have some sort of secular rationale. Now, it may be that you believe what you believe because of a religious rationale, but when you make an argument to a third party, that person has to be addressed on their own level, right? And this is something that I think is true of all human interaction. You have to address people on their own level. I don't talk to my 4.5-year-old the way that I talk to an audience. I don't talk to an audience the same way that I talk to a family member, an individual. You have to address people how they want to be addressed. My view of conversation and debate is that the person I'm talking to gets to pick the weapon. So if we want to go at it with rapiers, then it'll be classy and nice. And if you want to go at it with meat hooks, then we can do that too. But you get to choose the weapon, and then we have a conversation on the level you want to have the conversation on.
Sir, will you pass this down? Thank you.
I was concerned when I talked to these graduate from one of our public universities, and we were talking politics, and we were talking Trump, and he was a conservative, which is abnormal in many college settings, and indicated that during his time there, that if he spoke out right regarding conservatism or Trump, and the professors would hear that, it would impact their college grade. You know, it's a sad commentary that free speech gets to the point when you are going to be degraded for what you believe in.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true, and it's a concern. I always tell college students, it's a question I get asked a lot by college students, is what should I do? If I'm in a class and a professor says something I think is dumb, but I'm afraid I'm going to be graded down, what do I do? And my answer is always, you really do have to gauge the risk-reward ratio here. You have to decide what's the cost and what's the benefit. Very often, it's of benefit to just be silent, get an A in the class, spit back at the professor what they want to hear, get an A in the class, go make a lot of money, and then refuse an alumni donation. Right? That's like giving the power to a professor who's going to punish you for no reason to do that and harm you seems to me counterproductive. Go talk to the other students outside of class. I'm not a big fan of the general political strategy of smacking your head against a brick wall repeatedly.
Yes, can you talk to, you're talking about the fundamentals of American history and the roots of that virtue. It's counterintuitive today, but our view of anthropology, that we're a broken people, that view undergirds the most liberty. Could you
Right.
talk about how, because I think that's really an issue today, because most people actually believe human beings are by nature good, and we really just need to restructure things so that all things will work out.
Right. I mean, the Judeo-Christian common belief that human beings are capable of sin and also are capable of goodness, but they are not inherently perfect or perfectible. This idea does undergird liberty in a couple of different ways. So, number one, it suggests the necessity for the inculcation of civilization and virtue, that you actually have to have structures that are created to make people better, but not necessarily governmental structures, social structures that are geared toward making people better and teaching them right from wrong. Right? This is where religious worldviews come in. This is why I say that religious worldview has to exist, otherwise you can't have liberty. And then the liberty-based idea comes in when you start discussing the fact that because people are not naturally perfect or perfectible, you have to give them the ability to rise or fall because they still have individual rights and they are made in the basis of God's image. The idea of free will is really the key, I think, to liberty. So the idea that you have the ability to choose, it's fundamental that if your choice is therefore constrained, then it's a violation of what you can do as a human being, and that if your ultimate goal as a human being is to draw, from a religious point of view, is to draw closer to God, the only way to draw closer to God is through an act of will, through an act of, whether you're talking about love or submission, whether you're talking about obeying or learning, it has to be something that you want to do, otherwise being forced into it is not of true value. Now, it's also worth noting that liberty, as conceived in the Bible, really only came to fruition partially just historically as a result of religious conflict. So I think, number one, Protestantism actually bringing the Bible away from a hierarchy and toward the idea that you yourself have the capacity to interpret moves in the direction of individual liberty, right? Lutheranism does a heavy dose of that. But beyond that, the Peace of Westphalia creates the conditions that are necessary for liberty to actually thrive historically. Before the Peace of Westphalia, you have a bunch of actual religious regimes that are basically cramming down whatever religion is at the head. And after Westphalia, suddenly religious minorities are given rights because religious people suddenly realize, okay, we can either beat each other's brains in or we can let each other live according to our various dictates. And that creates the foundation for liberty, but liberty within a society that is still guided by common religious values. See, that's the great irony of the religious wars that destroyed Europe for centuries, is that the differences between the groups in those religious wars theologically is certainly a lot smaller than the differences between the groups in Europe and in the Judeo-Christian tradition and other religious groups, for example, that exist elsewhere, other cultures that exist elsewhere. And so you could have a thriving society without cramming down a version of Protestantism or a version of Catholicism or a version of any religion, because they still did have this common thread that could be held together by a belief in God and certain fundamental principles.
Well, how do you, because of the mob mentality, and the mob mentality is like I read yesterday where the lady from Colbert Report says, well, at least we ruined like Brett Kavanaugh's life.
Right.
Like, that type of stuff. 90% of the people I interact with online are conservative. The 10% are the only ones that you hear from, really, because of the fear if you speak out. Potentially, like CNN speaks about it, and then all of a sudden it goes viral, and like no one goes to your business,
right?
Or they're calling your place of employment. Is there a way to get out, like conservative views, to put out a platform that you think is important to put out without having to worry about just like the ramifications?
I mean, without having to worry, the answer now, unfortunately, is no. That's not the country we live in. Right? We live in it's a scary time for business owners particularly, but for anybody really, because people can just start digging through everything you've ever tweeted or everything you've ever said on Facebook, find something they don't like, and then launch a boycott against you the next day. It makes for a very, very ugly country. And I think that either we're going to learn that either we're going to have our own social Peace of Westphalia, or this is just going to continue. Right? Either at a certain point we're going to say, you get to say what you want to say, and I'm still going to shop at your business, and as long as you make a good table and you're a carpenter, then we're good. And I don't really care what you have to say about Trump's tax policy. Until we get to that point, then it's going to get uglier and uglier. And it may have to get uglier before people actually go weapons off, before they say, okay, I'm going to back away from the table now. We're not going to play this game anymore. I was the head of an organization called Truth Revolt, and we actually did this, right? After the left started boycotting Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Mark Levin, we actually initiated boycotts against people at MSNBC, not because we like boycott tactics, but simply to say, and we said this openly, we don't like boycott tactics, we're using them because you guys have to learn that this can cut the other way, and this is not a country you want to be a part of. So if you actually would like a better country, you're going to have to back off a little bit and let people have their own opinions on matters. Also, capitalism tends to take care of a lot of these things. I mean, the left is deeply worried all the time. Oh, well, what if there's a discriminatory business and it decides that it's not going to cater to a particular group? Well, then they will lose money in all likelihood, because this is a very free market country in terms of what you're able to buy and sell. So but it is a scary, listen, it's scary. It keeps me up at night, right? I have kids. It keeps me up at night. Will somebody find something that I don't even remember I said back when I was 16 years old and then come after me? And the answer is yes, they will, right? They will. It's very difficult to live comfortably right now in the world of politics. And I fear that that's one area where I'm deeply pessimistic. I think it's going to get uglier, not better anytime soon.
On that point, Ben, Hillary Clinton 3 hours ago said on CNN, it's time for the left to stop being civil and take the gloves off. Now, her and her husband are going on a tour. You know about it next year.
Yeah, I mean, I know they're touring around. It's called something like Evenings with Bill and Hillary, and I was just wondering how much they had to pay Bill to spend the evening with Hillary. He hasn't done it in years.
Well, my question is this. If they think they've been civil and they're taking the gloves off, what is our response? And how do we,
our response...
Where do we go?
So first of all, I think most Americans don't like this stuff. I think most Americans really are not ready for a civil war, and the people on the left who think they are ready for a civil war seem to forget that everybody in Texas has the guns. So it's a very, very bad idea. I mean, it's really quite foolish. As far as Hillary Clinton, what I like about Hillary Clinton, I admire about Hillary Clinton, is that she's so robotic about everything. It really is amazing. Like, as somebody who's not big on emotion, I sort of admire that about Hillary. She's sort of like the original Terminator. She like underneath the skin is some sort of weird exoskeleton. It's bizarre. What I mean by that is that there are people who are crazy in the Democratic Party, like Maxine Waters, who actually believes this stuff, like mob rule, let's go get people. And then there's Hillary, who thinks that she's sitting there and she's like, I will channel the rage of my base by saying this. And in Machiavellian fashion, I will say that mob rule ought to apply. And then she does it, and it's the least convincing thing ever, because that's just who Hillary Clinton is. But this is what the left wants. The base of the Democratic Party believes that they haven't fought back hard enough. And as you say, I don't know what strategy they are talking about employing. I have a feeling all they really mean is we're going to get so mad that we're going to get our vote out. That's really what they mean in the end. But the way that it comes out is we are not going to stop people from confronting people in places of business, or chasing Brian Kilmeade down the street in New York, or going into a restaurant with Ted Cruz's wife and trying to drive him out of the restaurant. It's funny, I've been asked, on Fox News they asked me whether I ever had that problem, whether people have actually tried to run me out of restaurants. And I said, well, that's the good news about keeping kosher. Those are my people. So I've never, every time I go to eat, it's my friends. But that is not, but unfortunately, that's really what this is going to become, is that people who are right-wing eat at right-wing restaurants, people who are left-wing eat at left-wing restaurants, and never the twain shall meet. These divisions, the social fabric has really been torn, and the Democrats are tearing it a lot further. I wish that if President Trump had a different personality, he would actually have the ability to rectify some of this. He would. If you were a more easygoing fellow, then the President of the United States really has an opportunity here, because the left is acting so unhinged and insane that he has the capacity to say, listen, I'm not that guy, right? I'm not doing that. We're all Americans, we're all brothers and sisters, and for them to do that is really gross and off-putting and disgusting. But the President, as we say, is not that type. So I fear that we are in a cycle to the bottom here. And again, I don't think that this is getting better anytime soon.
Hi, Ben. Is there any chance that you'll run for the presidency in the future?
So, to be honest, I used to think about it a lot more. I've stopped thinking about it quite so much because two reasons. So, reason number one, I have 2 kids under 5, and it seems like an awful lifestyle. I mean, it really does. Not being president, but the campaigning seems really, truly awful. Being away from my kids that much, this is a hard week for me because I'm giving 3 speeches in a week, and I really miss my kids a lot, and I want to go home and see my kids. So doing that for months on end sounds really garbage. But the other reason that, you know, I'm less likely to run than before is because I try to be a decent human being, and I think that we're trying to drive every decent human being out of politics right now by misconstruing everything they say deliberately to destroy them. And it's really unpleasant. I've been targeted by this several times, and I lose sleep every time, because if you're a good person, your first response to criticism is, maybe that's true, right? That's always your first response to criticism. Somebody says something bad about you, and you go, oh my God, maybe that's real. Maybe I did do that thing. And it keeps you up at night because you want to be better than you are if you're trying to improve yourself constantly. Well, being a candidate means that you are getting nothing but that, and the vast majority of it is dishonest, so it's really not good for your health. That said, is there a possibility that at some point in the future I could see doing something like that? Yes, but the conditions would have to be right, and I'd have to feel like the country was ready to rally around a certain amount of decency as opposed to merely just hurling crap at each other. And listen, I'm good at hurling crap. Like, I have a good arm, at least for crap. But that's it. But I also would like to, I'd like to be, if we're going to have a campaign of that sort, I'd like to have a campaign in which I wouldn't have to feel bad about calling for a certain level of civility. And so, you know, hopefully we'll get to the point where running for office outweighs the work that I have to do outside the office. That's the real answer. I have a lot of listeners. I have a lot of folks I affect, particularly young people. And running for the presidency is actually a step down from what I do. I have an enormous number of listeners, thank God. And that means that speaking to those people every day is more important to me than giving a stump speech somewhere that not a huge number of people are listening to. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. If you can hang out for
Yeah.